Hello, welcome. It's William Bell with All Things Fulfilled. What I'm going to do is do a very short video, at least I hope it will be very short, to talk about the relationship of the fall of the temple to the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, there are some who believe that the fall of the temple and the resurrection have no connection whatsoever, but let's see what we can find in the scriptures. We're going to share our screen and take a look at Bible Hub on Matthew 24 and verse 3. And I'm looking at the interlinear where you can see both the English and the Greek. Now, we understand the scripture in English where it says, as they were sitting upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him, meaning to the Lord, to Jesus, and asked him privately, saying, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus had just spoken about not one stone upon the temple would be left standing. That is, they all would be thrown down. And they therefore questioned him about that. And they wanted to know, well, when were these things going to be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, the word end of the age, which is not world, as you see in the King James Version, it's the end of the age, is from a Greek word, syntelios. And you see the word here. The first part of the word is a prefix, soon, S-U-N. And then the last part, T-E-L-E-I-A-S, teleos. And that word has its root as telos, or the end. So they're asking, when would the end consummate? When would all these things come about? And notice again, it's the end of the age. So that's what they're talking about. The end of the age of the temple, the end of the age of Moses, the end of that old covenant age. When is this going to come to pass? Now, Jesus gave them an answer in the 14th verse of Matthew 24. And this is what he said, that the gospel had to be preached in all the inhabited earth as a witness to all the nations, and then the end would come. And he uses the same word that he used in Matthew 24 and verse 3. He says, then the end, or then will come the end. There's the word telos. So he's talking about the end of the age, the end of the temple. This chapter is unquestionably about the fall of the temple. And one other thing Jesus said concerning this. Now, before we go to that additional point, he's saying the gospel had to be preached as a witness in all the inhabited earth, and then the end would come when it had gone to all the nations. Well, in Romans chapter 10, verse 18, Paul said that the gospel had gone to the ends of the earth and to all the inhabitable world. And so he uses the very words that are used here to say that the gospel had been preached. And that was before 70 AD in the late 50s when Romans was written. In addition, in chapter 16, verse 26, he said the gospel had been made known to all the nations. And then in Colossians 1, 5, and 6, citing Mark's gospel of preaching the gospel to all the world, or the cosmos, and to all the creation, he said in Colossians 1, 5, and 6 that it had gone to all the cosmos, to all the world. And again, in verse 23, that it had been preached to all the creation, using the word katesis. So the conditions had been met. They're in the first century. This is before the destruction of Jerusalem had occurred, where we had learned from Matthew 24 that the preaching of the gospel to all the nations, the world, and the creation, etc., was a prerequisite to the coming of the end, the telos, the goal that had to be reached. Now, let's go to 1 Corinthians. And by the way, before we leave that, in Matthew 24:14, when he says then it would come, if we look in verse 34 of the chapter, he tells you, assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away, will not have passed away until all these things take place. So the fall of the temple, the consummation of the age, the parousia, or the coming of the Lord, and the preaching of the gospel, the fall of the temple, all of that would have occurred before that generation passed away. Now, let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and see if there is any evidence to demonstrate that the temple would fall at the time of the resurrection. Now, this is the resurrection chapter. Nobody doubts. In 1 Corinthians 15, we're going to go to verse 24. Let's do it this way. Let's go back to the top and let's go down to verse 24. And in verse 24, the text says, then the end. That's the word telos. Then the telos, when he shall hand over the kingdom to God, when he shall deliver up the kingdom to God and the Father, when he shall have put down or annulled all dominion and all authority and power. So then comes the end. Then comes the telos. Well, that's the same telos that was spoken of in Matthew 24:3 and also in Matthew 24 and verse 14. If you consult Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, Kittle states that Matthew 24, 14 and 1 Corinthians 15:24 are parallel texts. They're talking about the same event. Now, he believed that it was all future, but we've seen the text that said it was going to happen before that generation passed away. So if Matthew 24:3 and 14 are talking about the telos, and 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about the telos in relation to the parousia, it has to be the same event. And thus, the fall of the temple is occurring at the time of the resurrection and vice versa. These are all events that are happening in that same time frame of the day of the Lord, which was an eschatological day and not a 24-hour day. It was an epoch of time. Now, when we look at that, we also see in 1 Corinthians 15, in verse 51, a statement just like Matthew 24:34. He says, behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Here is Paul saying, not everyone in that generation would fall asleep. Now, when he talked about the 500 brethren earlier, in verse 6, I believe it is, he said, there were 500 brethren, of whom the greater part remain unto this present, but some have fallen asleep. Well, Paul said not all of them would fall asleep before the Lord came, before the parousia, before the telos came. So you can see the correlations in 1 Corinthians 15 are dealing with the same thing. And by the way, that very text that says he must reign till he put all enemies under his feet is quoted from the Psalm, which is a text dealing with Christ as a high priest, indicating the change of the priesthood, and therefore the fall of the old temple in Jerusalem and the establishing of the new. Now, 1 Corinthians 15 and 1 Thessalonians 4 are both resurrection texts. And the people who comment on these texts see 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15 as parallel, dealing with the same resurrection and time frame. As a matter of fact, they'll even throw in John chapter 14. When we look at 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Thessalonians 4 tells us that those events likewise would happen before that generation passed away. Because he says, we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not prevent those who are asleep. Notice, this for you we declare in the word of the Lord, that we the living, remaining until the coming, that's Paul in the first century with the Thessalonians, until the coming, that's the parousia, same as in Matthew 24:3, of the Lord, shall not, and he uses a double negative, no, not, shall not, all right, precede those who have fallen asleep. Same thing in verse 17, we who are alive, we the living, remaining together with them. He wasn't talking about people far off, 2,000 years away. We the living. And so all of this would happen before that generation passed away. So to separate the fall of the temple That happened in 70 AD when all the stones of the temple were thrown down, not one stone left upon another. The gospel had to go to all the nations, to all the cosmos before that event occurred, but it would happen in that generation. And that was the time of the parousia and the consummation of the age. That's the telos. Same goal, same end, found in 1 Corinthians 15:24 and 1 Thessalonians 4, even though the word's not used there. But since we know that the resurrection of 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15 are parallel, same time frame given, then we can't make it any other time than the destruction of the temple in 70 AD when those events occurred. They occurred in the end of the age, or at the end of the age, occurring in the time of the last day, carrying it into the age to come. All right, with that, that's the end. Visit our website at allthingsfulfilled.com. Leave us a comment on the YouTube channel, pro or con, and we will interact with those comments. Until the next time, I'm William Bell saying you have a very good evening.